Next up is Moran-Ledesma, and he's from the University of Minnesota in the US. And usually he's building 3D prototypes, but also with physical props to improve interactions with the virtual reality. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So thank you so much, guys, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Marco Moran-Ledesma. I am a PhD student at the University of Waterloo from Canada. And today I will be presenting our paper on user-defined gestures with physical props in virtual reality, written in collaboration with my supervisors, Dr. Mark Hancock and Dr. Oliver Schneider. Recently, there has been an increase in research towards using hand gestures for interaction in different fields, such as tabletops, public displays, mobile devices, and even virtual reality using a pair of handheld controllers. Particularly in this field, virtual reality, people might prefer to use haptic props to complete tasks and actions. As we know, researchers and designers have increasingly used haptic props in VR to resemble the real-world counterpart. But little is understood about how people want to leverage props and what gestures and manipulations they want to do with them. Our work, therefore, aims to provide understanding for gesture design in VR, with the novelty of utilizing physical props. This led us to two main questions. What gestures do people choose with props in VR? And what props do people choose for those gestures? To answer the former, we elicited a set of gestures with props that can be used in VR, which we describe with context-free grammars. In doing so, we found that people look for shapes and affordances, not for the right props. In fact, we saw that a small number of props handles our set of gestures. So after this, we decided to examine agreement among people to pick props, for which we introduced a novel agreement score formula that allows for elicitation of multiple choices, that is, multiple props. Let's discuss what gestures people choose to make in VR. We design a study that follows the traditional elicitation approach from Warburg et al., where 7 female and 14 male participants were shown the effect of a referent in VR, picked a set of props from a large vocabulary available in front of them, and then made a gesture that could cause the effect they just watched. We included 20 VR references, 15 from CAD-like applications, for example, extruding or bending, and 5 from open world games, for example, opening a door, closing a door, or turning on a light. We had a total of 90 props and a small set of Lego blocks. We incorporated, as you can see, different materials and types: 3D printed objects, Lego figures and blocks, retail manufactured objects, and even gaming controllers. Gestures might involve different props. For example, any of us can make a chopping gesture with a traditional knife. But we could also use things like a sword, a cleaver knife, and a Swiss knife to do the same thing. To capture these variations in our study, we adopted context-free grammars, where props received hard-coded names to describe their role. In this example, the gesture can be articulated as chop with cutting prop, where cutting prop can be any of the tools I just mentioned. Let's discuss the outcome of our study then. Consider the following referent. Two of our 21 participants made a cutting gesture with a green cube and a sword. Two more participants did the same thing using a gray cube and a knife. And a fifth participant meant to be holding a cube with one hand and depicted the same cutting gesture with a knife in the other hand. We group these prop variations for this gesture with context-free grammars as it is shown. Let's see another example. One participant performed this gesture with a couch and a plane. And another participant did the same thing with a completely different set of props. In a similar way, we captured these variations with context-free grammars. The rest of our participants depicted different gestures for this referent. In the end, for each VR referent in our study, the most used gesture was designated the representative gesture. In this case, the one on the left. Here is our complete gesture set with context-free grammars for each VR referent. You can take a closer look at it in the paper. Now, in examining the context-free grammars in our prop gesture set, we found that with just 12 different props and a spare group of Lego blocks, people can complete the 20 representative gestures that we just saw. This led us to explore why those particular props. What was the decision-making process of our participants? What choices did they make? What did they see in these 12 props? Consider the scenarios from one of the previous slides. Here we see that some props were chosen multiple times by multiple participants. The green cube, for example, and the knife were both chosen by 3 people. And the gray cube and the sword were used by 2 people each. From this point forward, we were interested in studying prop agreement score. However, existing metrics were insufficient. Let's analyze a simple example to illustrate why. Recognizing gesture agreement in a group of participants ultimately comes down to yes or no. And this can be represented with zeros and ones. The existing gesture agreement formula from Batabu and Bobrok can handle this, as it accounts for agreement among single inputs. Prop sets, however, include multiple inputs. The existing agreement formula can be used, but agreement would only exist if the sets included the same props. Is that really what's happening here in what you see? 2 sets are identical, P1 and P4. 3 sets include a cube, P1, P2, and P4. And 2 sets carry a paintbrush, P2 and P3. So instead of using zeros and ones, we decided to study the similarity of each pair of participant sets. After this, we derived a generalization of Batabu and Wobrok's formula that we define as the sum of the similarity of each pair of sets by the number of pairs of sets that could be identical, where similarity can be calculated with one of these 3 set similarity measures: Jacquard index, Sorensen, or the overlap coefficient, being this one the most optimistic. The main feature of our generalization is that it measures agreement for multiple selections, but it also reproduces agreement for a single selection, calculated with Batabu and Wobrok's formula. Here is a graph that includes the gesture agreement score for each of our reference. These were calculated with the existing formula presented by Batabu and Wobrok. And now we add the prop agreement scores for each referent using our proposed generalization. By looking at this graph, we gained insights on the strategies that our participants might have followed in the study. Notice that the gesture agreement score of rotate is much higher than the prop agreement. This might suggest that participants were more interested in designing the appropriate gesture for it, and that a lot of props could be used. In other words, participants only cared about the gesture. When we look at the representative gesture for this referent, we see that they simply made a 180-degree rotation with one hand. Many props, if not all, could be used for that. Now notice the contrast between the gesture and prop agreement scores of color. This time, the prop agreement is much higher than the gesture agreement, suggesting that the prop used might be more relevant. As you see here, the representative gesture is just the open palm, an open palm with a prop on it. But the two props used must denote a difference in color. The results of our work have implications on haptic props and artifacts for VR interaction. If we intend to use props for user input in VR systems, researchers can leverage existing tracking methods. Some of our gestures involve clearly defined translations and rotations, which can be sensed with electromechanical sensors like IMUs. Others, however, might better use vision-based systems. Researchers should also consider designing multipurpose, reconfigurable, and reusable props that include several shapes and affordances, something similar to the Swiss knife concept. Last but not least, users need a dedicated space where they can pick and place props. To do this, approaches like a tool belt or a special pocket could be explored. To summarize, we have presented a gesture set with props for 20 VR reference. Our context-free grammars were an effective and expressive way to describe them. We found that people look for shapes, affordances, and attributes in props, not for the right props. And finally, the generalization formula that we propose enables or might enable new elicitation studies, where agreement among multiple modalities could be measured. Thanks so much for being here and for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Marco, for the very fun presentation and also, again, showing the props. That was really helpful in understanding it. And again, it's time for questions. However, I will take the chance as a chair to ask the first one. I was wondering, because you use the props and the gestures to make like this connection with the virtual space by having physical props and real movements that you know from real life. How did you implement or rather map gestures for gestures that are rather abstract than mirroring, inverting, or multiplying?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Could you repeat it?
The first part was not a question, that was just a statement. I was wondering about how you implemented or mapped the gestures, or how you would map gestures for more abstract things like multiplying or mirroring.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We adopted this eliciting approach from previous gesture elicitation studies, where we had a set of props in a table. Participants would come in and we would ask them to propose a gesture with any of the props that they wanted for a total of 20 VR reference. It's like we handed off the baton of gesture design to our participants rather than us design them, or rather than taking the designer approach, if that makes sense. Like we let them depict those gestures.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions? look in the chat. Okay, then I got another one. You showed wide variety of different props that they could choose from. However, how did you pre-select those items? Were there any attributes you looked for, or a wide spread of attributes? How did you do that?
There is two, I guess there is two things to consider here. The first one, for gestures, we didn't impose, as I was probably explaining for the first question. For gestures, we didn't impose any restriction on what participants could make. You know, like they were completely free to do any manipulation that they wanted with their hands and with other and with the props. So we try to say mimic that same lack of imposition for props by having first a very large vocabulary, as you saw in the picture, like more than 90 props were used. And at the same time, we also try to be as diverse as possible. So we took a look at kind of like therapy called the centroid therapy, where people use objects to represent a scene of their own feelings and emotions. And we gained some insights on what could be helpful or useful to have in that large vocabulary of props. So we picked things like animals, tools, avatars. We also like try to be, creative, and, things that look interesting to us were included. Things like abstract geometrical shapes, like, a simple cube or a simple plane. We also were a little bit, we also were diverse with the type of materials that we used. Some parts were mobile, some parts were very rigid, some things were toys. But in the end, it all comes down to that lack of imposition that we wanted to have in our study for props, and as we did for gestures.
All right, thank you. Do we have a question?
I saw a hand.
Hi, great work. I really enjoyed your talk. From what you just mentioned, this initial pre-selection of different props, did you get some kind of an indication to what extent roughness or smoothness or such parameters of the surface played a role when selecting a prop? So I think we have talked a lot about shape, but what is with the more tactile qualities?
That's a good point. I don't know. We use the same 3D printer to create them. We didn't really worry too much about textures, roughness, and all that. We cared more about having, things that were rigid, things that were flexible, because that's what our printer is capable of. At the beginning of the study, we gave our participants an opportunity to be familiar with all these props. I don't know, I'm talking about 5, 7, 8 minutes for them to, just grab any prop, familiarize themselves, see what the attributes of the props were. Perhaps, I don't know, they were interested in some more than others, because probably they were more interested about the 3D printed ones, probably about the Lego ones. I don't know, but definitely roughness and textures were not really a design requirement, or not requirement, but thing that we consider when fabricating these props.
Thanks.
All right, so thank you once again for your presentation.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone.